Right here. Is it okay for you? I'm honored to be here, and I want to thank the Cohn Institute for inviting me. Gideon and Ariella cautioned me not to thank them, but since everybody else has so far, I'd like to extend my appreciation to them as well. My intersection actually with Naamah was very brief when she was a small child. As it happens, Gideon was on a fellowship at Stanford University, and our children played together and became friends in a preschool on the Stanford campus. So little did I imagine 20 more years later that we would intersect again. The interface between the history of science and dance is not an area of developed scholarship. But my own personal research has looked fairly extensively at early 20th century dance as a cultural phenomenon. So it's a particular pleasure for me today to have the stimulation of Naamah's important new book to lend me, give me an excuse really to look at this intersection between history of science and dance during the early decades of the 20th century. She makes an important and I think major intervention in introducing the primacy of movement as a visual but also kinesthetic presence in the design and interpretation of the Rorschach Inkblot experiment. In so doing, she brings psychiatry and psychology into a productive new tension with early 20th century visual and performing arts. In particular, I think she discovers the primacy of movement perceived, imagined, or remembered as a vital sensory channel that really shapes how individuals saw the ink blots as visual triggers that Rorschach encoded. In her own language, she said, the sensation of movement was experienced by proxy. She says this by way of explaining how in the Rorschach test, the subject's dynamic impulses were projected onto the static ink blot. The result was that the Rorschach blot came to embody the seemingly paradoxical condition of physical restraint, giving rise to associational freedom. The test taker was seated and reflexively used movement memory in assigning meaning to the ink patterns before them. Now, Western Europe at the turn of the century had a particular obsession with unmasking and freeing and unfettering the body. These are impulses that played out among scientists but also artists. Both realms evidenced a fascination with how we might read the depths from the surfaces, how we might objectify the invisible landscape of the body's interior onto an exterior image. It's the nature of these correspondences between science and art I would like to probe through an exploration of how three of the most celebrated dancers working in Europe and America during this turn of the century period, Loie Fuller, Isadora Duncan, and Mary Wigman, were exploring aesthetic strategies that were very closely parallel to those of Rorschach. They too were decoding how the invisible might be brought up into view, and how to renegotiate the tension between freedom and constraint for the performing body. Our path through these connections will be guided by three questions. First, how do we assign meanings to visual objects, images, and bodies when they are deliberately ambiguous? Second, how are internal emotions encoded in external behavior? And third, how do we release or control the inner forces of the body? Now, although these perceptual habits are intertwined, I'm going to endeavor to keep them fairly distinct by highlighting a different one through a reading of one of each of these three dancers I just named. And there's a larger question that hangs over all of this, which is, how do these concerns connect Rorschach's work with the complex intellectual and cultural early modernist environment that included dance? So first, making meaning out of ambiguity, Loie Fuller. The inkblots, like the dancer, look ordinary at first glance. They appear nothing more than watery spills across paper, muddy bleeds that stop short of dripping off the page. At first glance, and particularly off stage, Loie Fuller, too, was unremarkable. She was a stout woman with plain features. She had essentially no dance training. And she had a very heavy, flat-footed way of moving. She was as unremarkable as an inkblot. But when Fuller stepped on stage and began to move, her form suddenly became a charged platform for images. Her real figure was blurred by the addition of yards of silk cloth and hidden sticks, which she used to manipulate these layers, swirling them in the air around her as they caught the illumination from banks of hidden colored lights. Instead of specificity, Fuller gave her audiences mystical uncertainty, the female dancer's body as an amorphous form. Fuller's performing has been described as a place for the redirection of physical force, an invitation to displace erotic kineticism onto her costumes, her technology, the air, and ultimately back onto the members of her public. Indeed, Fuller's performances made space for her audience to project their desires as she became a tabula rasa, a living projection screen. Now, this is a brief historic clip, actually, of Fuller herself dancing. I'll talk through it and show it. And I'd like you to note the sort of metaphor of initially a bat, which metamorphoses into Fuller. And, of course, a bat is an image that recurs in a lot of subjects' reading of the Rorschach inkblot experiment. Fuller was American-born with a career that unfolded in Paris beginning in 1892. The poet Stéphane Mallarmé dubbed her an invented art form balanced between the organic and inorganic, one in which the literal drama of theatrical transformation played out on stage. Now, Fuller, as you watch her here, did not play or portray something. This is the bat. Sort of low-tech animation. She did not play or portray something. Rather, she subsumed her physical self. Effectively, she presented her body as a neutral landscape, which the viewer was invited to animate through his imagination. And notice how non-technical this movement is, the flat little feet, the body that is pretty much just like a lump there, not a lot of virtuosity or flexibility. It looks pretty ordinary, looks pretty prosaic by today's standards, but this was the height of exoticism in its time. The ties between soma and psyche have long been rich territory for dance, and while we don't know if Rorschach frequented dance performances, the cities through which he circulated, Zurich, Bern, Moscow, among others, were rich with viewing opportunities, and Fuller circulated through these cities as well. So this new dance abstraction that Fuller was helping to pioneer was in the air and was certainly available to Rorschach. We do know that along with the aristocracy, European high culture embraced Loie Fuller enthusiastically and often used her as an object of aesthetic contemplation. Mallarmé and Yates wrote about her. René Lalique and Louis Comfort Tiffany fashioned her image in glass and crystal objects. Massenet and Debussy, the composers, made music for her. Her close friend, the sculptor Auguste Rodin, made bronze casts of her hands. Fuller also fascinated the world of academic science. She gained the admiration and friendship of Marie and Pierre Curie, as well as of astronomer Camille Flammarion, all of whose laboratories she regularly visited. These scientists who were drawn to Fuller understood that the world is not grasped objectively, but imaginatively, by, among other things, metaphors that we generate through embodied experience. Now, this is a second clip. This is a Fuller imitator. The landscape was covered with facsimiles of Fuller. And this clip is noteworthy because the Lumiere brothers in France hand-tinted every frame. This is long before color film existed. And they wanted to convey this quality of the play of colors in Fuller's performances. So this is a Fuller imitator with Lumiere brothers hand-painted tinting. And it gives you a sense of the use of color, which also was important in Rorschach's Inkblots. And you can imagine this would be what Fuller looked like. It's much faster than it really was because of the film-to-video transfer. As soon as Fuller started performing, the specificity of her body disappeared into the amorphous swirls of her massive lengths of silk that were her costume. At the same time, colored spotlights dyed the silk a variety of deep jewel tones. The audience saw not a woman, but a giant violet, a butterfly, a slithering snake, a white ocean wave. These are all titles she listed for her dances at her debut at her Folies Bergère performances. Fuller's work exaggerated a deep aspect of performance, its unique doubleness, where one is a living individual, but also the image she is performing. And this structure allows body experience to be shaped into a visual image and be projected metaphorically. Contemporary reviews document Fuller's power as coming from her thrilling reenactments of precisely this metamorphosis. And Stéphane Mallarmé here has a quote which reads very much like almost an interpretation of the Inkblot, the idea that giant butterflies' petals unfolding from this expanding web, the dizziness of the soul made visible by an artifice. Fuller seemed to keep her body and at the same time merge with the realm of the non-human. The idea of doubling, folding, twinned forms was one of the images that astonished audiences who watched Fuller. Writers described her in language that echoes the Inkblots and the process of personal disclosure they prompted. Fuller seemed to split and double herself over and over again, mutating into a series of dramatic and ever-changing shapes, exposing the secrets hidden within, one wrote. This double image, of course, is also an essential feature of the Inkblots, with their conscious doubling through the folding of the paper that gives you the image mirrored on the other side. Fuller was an enactment of the newly blurred boundaries of the fin de siècle. Specifically, this is the boundary between the human and the machine, and by extension, between the artist and the scientist. Scholars celebrated Fuller's performances as offering a healthy version of the 19th century Freudian hysteric, whom you saw earlier in the slides, by virtue of her being a woman who consciously controlled the illusion that her movement was out of control. And this is Fuller herself. These qualities of displacement, transformation, and control are important elements that Akavia remarks on in her tracing of how the subjects in Rorschach's experiment, quote, projected their dynamic impulses onto the static inkblot. The phrase dynamic impulse is key here, for it is the dynamism of the memory of movements, what she notes Rorschach defined as the M response, which mediated responses to the inkblots. Movement remembered thus shaped movement perceived, a phenomenon Rorschach called kinesthetic engrams. Now in dance we call this kinesthetic echo, and it's the idea that if you watch a dance performance and your body has any history of doing the movement that you see performed, particularly for dancers, you feel an involuntary twinge or twitch, and it's the muscle almost speaking to the image of the other muscle performing. It's that deep encoded within us, this movement history. So there was a pervasive fascination during this period in relying on the capacity of images to penetrate the mind directly. Because the inkblots made one work to perceive and describe them, as Dr. Akavia notes, Rorschach's experiment was interpreted as one whose chance features, and to quote her again, jolted the subject out of his habits of perception into a liminal, anchorless state. In Fuller's dancing, this liminality actually became the text of her performance. So on to this question of how do we give external shape to internal emotions, and Isadora Duncan is our guide here. X-rays of the soul is the shorthand title that the Harvard History of Science professor Peter Gallison gave to an exhibition of the Rorschach inkblots he curated at Harvard's Science Center this past spring. A secret X-ray of the soul is supposedly what a subject who took the Rorschach unknowingly divulged. This phrase is not just metaphorically apt, but also historically. In 1895, the German physicist Wilhelm Röntgen accidentally discovered an image cast from his cathode ray generator could penetrate human flesh and be photographed. He named these X-rays, X for unknown. Now, Rorschach was certainly aware of this recent scientific advancement, which penetrated the very sheath of the body, objectifying its invisible depths into an external image. When in 1911 he began experimenting with the chance forms of inkblots on paper. Reflections of the Soul is also how the California-born dancer Isadora Duncan referred to her dancing during these same years in an effort to name the intimate connection between soma and psyche and legitimize the body in motion that her art celebrated. By calling dance an outward expression of the soul, Duncan was describing the dancing body as spiritual rather than profane. She reshaped dance, an art form in which the dancing body, up until this moment, had never really been considered much more than a social diversion at best or an evil distraction at worst, and moved it into an expression of naturalness based on physical release. She seemed to materialize her spectators' inner longings and impulses. Duncan's theater presented an image of the fluid self, an image of becoming freely and spontaneously. It was like a choreographic Rorschach for her audiences. Now, Duncan herself, despite her celebrity, never trusted the camera. She never allowed herself to be filmed during her entire career. This is the only known footage of Duncan. It is less than a minute long, and some enterprising fan hid in the bushes at a garden party with his camera and took this footage. It goes by quickly, but we know it's Duncan by the carriage of her arms, the upper body, the openness of the torso, and it's, of course, silent. And you'll see her in a Grecian tunic, the idea, again, of the body, the form of the body being neutralized to enhance its expressiveness. And with her famous shawls, this ease, this look of spontaneity, the casualness in the midst of these heavily corseted, suited bodies. That was it. All the Duncan footage. You've now just been privileged to a rich part of dance history. Duncan made the body a conspicuous participant in America's social, cultural, and political life. And she brought this natural, expressive body to Europe beginning in 1899. She showed how body movement became a place where ideas about the nation, culture, women, art, self were publicly and explicitly negotiated. Her performances were reminders of how central bodies are as forms that convey intended and unintended meanings through movement. Dr. Akavia suggests that Rorschach's experiments demonstrated that memories of movement never leave us, that especially in the act of perception, we use these kinesthetic references to make important associations. Rorschach, too, was interested in the role movement, perceptions, joined with perceptions of form and color, played in respondents' interpretations of his inkblots. Responses dominated by movement responses were characterized by greater creative ability and by more inner life, Akavia summarizes Rorschach's conclusions. Since the 20th century, dance, too, has been premised on this belief that perception is embodied. Duncan's dancing represented how internal emotions are encoded in external behavior through an actively expressive body. And in order to awaken this expressiveness, she banished mirrors from her dance studio. She felt it distracted the dancer into looking at an external image rather than searching for the internal one. This is brief footage with sound of a reconstruction of Duncan's work. This is her Scherzo to Schubert's Ninth Symphony, danced by Laurie Bellylove's company, and Bellylove's company is one of the best Duncan reconstructors. I'll let you look at a bit of it. It does have sound. And if you watch, you should notice that it has the freedom of play. It looks as if it's being made up on the spot, and it's not. It's very carefully planned. And notice how the movement ripples through the whole body. There are no poses, there are no pauses. It's like an impulse that drives them forward. So that's Duncan in action. Duncan made the radical shift of using the expressive body for not just self-expression, but also for a complex semiotics of representation. From the start, she sought to reveal not only her inner stirrings, but those of her spectators as well. Quote, "Come, for here is the mirror of your life to you," she wrote in an 1898 program note to prepare audiences for viewing her dancing. "You will see reflected the soul of life," she promised viewers. Now, just as the apparent spontaneous naturalness of Duncan's dances was illusory, so too were certain elements of the chance quality of Rorschach's inkblots. His inkblots, this invitation to the spectator, provided a visual stimulus that jolted him, moving him from a mode of passive perception to an active engagement with the images presented. Gregory Meyer, who's a professor at the University of Toledo and who specializes in personality assessment, actually went back and looked at Rorschach's early paintings because he was a painter before he went to medical school. And he describes in those paintings a fascination with competing visual stimuli, where Rorschach drew these hybrid animals like a figure that was half frog and half cat, or half rooster and half squirrel. And he painted them to invite a deliberate confusion in his viewers. It's a not too distant step, I think, from these youthful works, which Meyer calls competing images, to the inkblots. Meyer has also demonstrated that the ink blots were actually touched up. They were edited, as he painted between the spills of ink to create not just purely accidental, pardon? Okay. Let me speed through the end. I was trying to speak more slowly. So he pilot tested these cards and worked with them with his patients and accented stimuli to make them more evocative of the kinds of responses he was looking for. It's a strategy that's parallel to Duncan's dancing, which seemed to offer her audiences limitless possibilities and in fact was very deliberately shaped. All right, the final dancer we'll consider briefly in closing is the German-born Mary Wigman, a contemporary of Rorschach's. She invented her own dance language based on the idea that dance does not necessarily involve predetermined steps and traditional forms, but that it can arise from an internalized sense of motion. She worked in Asconia, Switzerland, in Monte Verita, which was a retreat for a number of psychiatrists, psychologists, and artists, and explored the way that the body could become a conveyor of organic unity of physical and spiritual forces. But her most important work from this period, actually from her whole life, was Hexentanz, witch dance, which she worked on from 1914 to 29. And it takes the idea of the dancer as a screen that Fuller and Duncan developed and pushes it further. One of the major insights of Akavia's scholarship is that we're projectors onto bodies around us, that we're constantly putting out interpretation of images and reflecting them back to ourselves. Hexentanz actually presents the dancer as projector as well as receiver. It's a tiny clip, which I'll talk through to accelerate the time. Wigman describes making this as undergoing a kind of Rorschach on her own. She glimpsed some fabric, silk, in a Swiss fabric store and went into a trance-like state and discovered it released her inner emotions. She later said, "It led me to create a part of me that was not recognizable. Only the restlessness and evil greed of my identity came out in my hands. This restlessness as I pressed my hands claw-like to the ground and in the air." All right, well, I hope this has provided a brief introduction to what Akavia so aptly called the interesting mirroring that existed between the work of psychologists, psychiatrists, and avant-garde artists during these early years of the 20th century, as both groups engaged in the study of liminal perceptual experiences objectified through art. Each of them in their own way helped to inaugurate a new concern with how exterior forms can be portals to our interiors. I end with an image of the dance that I began with and that's on the poster, Sharon Ayal's Bill that she created for Batsheva. It's a glimpse of how now in the 21st century, these early movements of dance and science's turn toward modernity we have been exploring, evolved into even more complex representations of the fragmentation and incoherence of modern life, and particularly its anxieties. We continue to serve as constant projectors onto the world around us, with movement as a unique medium to reflect back to us with increasing vividness our human condition. Thank you.